She poured coffee like she'd done it 1,000 times. Because she had. Nobody in that diner knew her real name. Nobody knew that 6 years ago, she had carried a wounded man 2 miles through enemy fire. Nobody knew that the woman refilling ketchup bottles had once been called by a call sign that made colonels sit up straighter. Then a stranger walked in wearing a ring she recognized. And everything she'd buried for 6 years started clawing its way back to the surface. Before we get into it, welcome to Silent Heroes. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Guess what branch you think our waitress served in. Now back to the story. Her name, the one on her name tag anyway, was Callie Reyes. 29 years old, quiet, unremarkable, exactly the way she wanted it. She worked the morning shift at a roadside diner outside Norfolk, Virginia, 3 miles from a naval base she never once mentioned. Her hands were steady, her voice was soft, and if you looked closely, which almost nobody did, you'd notice the faint scar tracing her left forearm, the kind that doesn't come from a kitchen accident. She had learned the fastest way to survive was to make herself small. Small enough that people's eyes slid right past her. Small enough that nobody asked questions. She kept her hair pulled back, wore plain clothes, and spoke only when spoken to. It wasn't shyness. It was strategy. The diner's manager, Roy Kessler, had a habit of humiliating the staff in front of customers. He called it keeping standards. Everyone else called it cruelty wearing a name tag. Reyes, you're not paid to think, you're paid to pour, he liked to say, loud enough for the whole counter to hear. Roy had built his entire identity on being the loudest man in any room, a coward who mistook volume for authority. One regular, an elderly man named Walt who came in every morning for black coffee and wheat toast, watched Callie more closely than most. You carry yourself like someone who's been somewhere, he told her one slow Tuesday. Somewhere most people don't come back from the same. She just smiled and refilled his cup. She never answered. But she never forgot he'd said it, either. It was a Thursday morning, just past 8, when the door burst open. A man staggered in, blood soaking through his jacket, his breathing shallow and fast. Behind him, chaos, someone shouting for an ambulance, chairs scraping, a woman screaming his name. Roy rushed over, puffing his chest out, barking orders that meant nothing. Everyone back. I said back. He pressed a napkin to the wound like it would do anything at all. Callie's eyes locked onto the injury in half a second. Entry wound, upper right chest, blood not spurting but pulsing. Venous, not arterial, but positioned dangerously close to the lung. His lips were already tinging blue at the edges. Tension pneumothorax. If nobody acted in the next 90 seconds, his lung would collapse entirely, and his heart would follow. Roy had no idea. He kept pressing the napkin, hands shaking, making it worse. Then the wounded man's eyes rolled toward Callie, and he whispered one word through blood-flecked lips. Falcon. The word hit the room like a detonation. Roy spun toward her. What did he just say? What does that mean? Callie said nothing. Her jaw tightened. Her hands, which had trembled slightly all morning from nothing more than caffeine and boredom, went suddenly, completely still. I'm asking you a question, Roy snapped. She didn't answer him. She was already moving. For 6 years, Callie had told herself she'd never do this again, never let that other person out, the one with steady hands and a mind that worked in triage and threat assessment instead of orders and refills. But some things don't stay buried. They wait. She dropped to her knees beside the man, ripped open a drawer of clean bar towels, and spoke in a voice nobody in that diner had ever heard from her before. Flat. Certain. Commanding. I need a knife, a straw, and tape. Now. A tension pneumothorax happens when air becomes trapped in the chest cavity outside the lung, building pressure with every breath until the lung collapses and the heart itself gets compressed. Left untreated, it kills in minute. The fix is brutal but simple. A needle or blade creates an opening to release the trapped air, buying time until real medical help arrives. It's a procedure combat medics are trained to perform under fire, with nothing but their hands and whatever's on them. Callie used a pocketknife from her apron, the straw from a to-go cup, and steady, practiced fingers. She made the incision 2 inches below the collarbone, inserted the straw to vent the trapped air, and taped it in place. The man's breathing eased almost immediately. Color returned to his lips. The diner went silent except for sirens approaching in the distance. Roy stood frozen, napkin still in his hand, utterly useless. "Where," he finally managed, "did you learn to do that?" Callie looked up at him, and for the first time in 6 years, she didn't look away. "Somewhere you've never been," she said. The paramedics arrived minutes later, took one look at the makeshift chest seal, and one of them asked, stunned, "Who did this?" Roy, red-faced and humiliated in front of the entire diner, saw his chance to salvage his authority the only way he knew how, by tearing someone else down. "She's not licensed for anything like this," he announced. "She could have killed him. I want her out. Today." The room erupted in protest, but Roy didn't care. He fired her on the spot, right there over the man she'd just saved, his voice booming louder than the sirens outside. Callie stood up slowly, wiped the blood from her hands with a bar towel, and looked him dead in the eye. "No," she said. "I am just done hiding." Roy laughed, short and ugly. "Done hiding? You're a waitress who almost got a man killed playing doctor. Get your things." A crowd had gathered by then, customers, cooks, the paramedics still working over the wounded man. Nobody moved to leave. Nobody said a word in Roy's defense. The silence itself was a verdict. Walt, the old regular, stepped forward from the counter, cane tapping against the tile. "That woman just saved his life," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You did nothing but get in the way, Roy. Everyone here saw it." Roy's face went red. "Stay out of this, old man." "No," Walt said. "I don't think I will." By the time the ambulance pulled away, a black SUV had rolled into the parking lot. 2 men in dress uniforms stepped out, moving with the kind of purpose that made the whole diner go quiet again. One of them, a silver-haired officer with a chest full of ribbons, walked straight up to Callie and stopped short, studying her face like he'd seen a ghost. "Petty Officer Reyes," he said. "Or should I say, Falcon?" Roy blinked. "You know her?" The officer didn't look at Roy. He addressed the room instead. "This woman is a former Navy corpsman, attached to a Special Operations Unit for 4 years. She earned a Silver Star for carrying a wounded SEAL 2 miles through hostile territory under fire, saving his life. That SEAL," he nodded toward the ambulance pulling away, "just happened to walk through your door this morning. Small world, or maybe not so small, he's been looking for her for 6 years. Gasps rippled through the diner. Roy stood there, mouth opening and closing with nothing coming out. "She left the service quietly," the officer continued. "For her own reasons. But her record speaks for itself, and today she just proved it hasn't gone anywhere." Roy, cornered and desperate, tried one last swing. "She's still fired. I run this diner, not the Navy." The officer finally turned to him, voice flat and final. "You just fired the woman who saved a decorated veteran's life in front of 30 witnesses, immediately after failing to help him yourself. I'd be more worried about your job than hers." It didn't take long after that for the truth about Roy to come apart at the seams. A regional health inspector, already looking into complaints about the diner's kitchen, discovered Roy had been falsifying safety logs for over a year to cut corners and pocket the difference in supply costs. The near-fatal delay in helping the wounded man became the final piece, proof that his ego and negligence weren't just cruel, they were dangerous. 2 days later, the wounded man, whose name was Dale, a former SEAL and old friend of the officer who'd arrived, asked to see Callie again, this time from a hospital bed instead of a bloody diner floor. "You didn't have to say anything," he told her. "You didn't have to move. You could have let someone else handle it." "No one else knew what they were looking at," Callie said. "I did." Dale studied her for a long moment. My daughter's been asking about you. She's 12. Wants to be a medic someday. Callie's throat tightened. She hadn't let herself think about a future like that in years. Not since the mission that ended with a name she couldn't say out loud, a fellow corpsman she hadn't been able to save the way she'd saved Dale. That loss was the real reason she'd disappeared into a quiet diner in the first place, hiding not from the Navy, but from her own memory of the one time it hadn't been enough. Tell her, Callie said slowly, that it's worth it, even on the days it isn't. The final confrontation wasn't a firefight or a chase. It was smaller than that, and somehow just as intense. Roy, facing termination and a fraud investigation, showed up at the hospital trying to pressure Dale into signing a statement denying any negligence, hoping to save what was left of his reputation. Security intervened before it went further, but for a few tense minutes, raised voices echoed down the hallway, monitors beeping steadily beside them like a countdown. 92 beats per minute. 94. Callie stepped between them without hesitation, calm as stone. Leave, she said. Now. He did. 3 weeks later, Callie stood in a modest office with a new title on the door, lead trauma coordinator of a newly formed community first responder training program, funded in part by the base and named, at Dale's insistence, in honor of the corpsman she'd lost overseas. Walt sat in the front row of her very first class, cane resting against his knee, beaming like a proud father. She wasn't hiding anymore. She didn't have to be small, and she didn't have to disappear into a name that wasn't hers. She'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to be seen, even when the world once taught you that hiding was safer. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is finally let themselves be known. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe to Silent Heroes, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in that diner that morning? The next story is already waiting. The end.